It started with a white pulse erupted from the sun, sharp, instantaneous, unnatural, and for a full 8 seconds the magnetosphere rang like a struck bell. NASA labelled it an X-class flare, the strongest of 2025, but inside every observatory, every control room, every solar monitoring station on Earth, scientists whispered the same question they weren't allowed to put in writing. Why did it happen exactly as 3I Atlas crossed the inner corona? Not before, not after, precisely then. And if you're enjoying this journey into the strangest mystery unfolding above us, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because the truth behind tonight's data drop is darker and more tangled than anyone expected. Also, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. You'll want to remember the moment this story began. Because when the flare hit, something else happened. Something that shouldn't have been possible. Every satellite watching 3I Atlas recorded the same anomaly. The object didn't brighten, dim, tumble, or fragment. It expanded. For less than a second, its silhouette warped outward, as if responding to the blast rather than being consumed by it. It was almost like the flare wasn't an attack or a coincidence, but a conversation, and 3I Atlas was answering. The timing was too precise, the energy spike too narrow. Veteran heliophysicists, the ones who speak carefully and only in metaphors when they're anxious, began calling it the mirrored flare, as if the sun didn't emit the pulse, but reflected it. One scientist compared it to sonar from an unseen source, as though something had pinged the sun and it responded with the strongest flare in a decade. And suddenly the question wasn't how it happened, but who initiated it. Telemetry from the Deep Space Network only made things stranger. In the milliseconds before the flare, the magnetic field around 3I Atlas tightened, not like ice expanding, not like debris heating up, but like a structure bracing. The field lines snapped into geometric alignment, forming a pattern that matched none of the known signatures of natural objects. Not a comet, not an asteroid, not a fragment of interstellar rock, something else, something that behaved like it had intent. And just when the scientific teams thought they had isolated the anomaly, another shockwave hit. Multiple sensors registered a narrowband radio signal immediately after the flare, not from the sun, not from Earth, but from 3I Atlas itself. The signal lasted exactly 0.7 seconds and carried no modulation humans could decode, except for one detail. The frequency it used was the same one NASA reserves for deep space probes, a channel that should have been silent, a channel no natural object should ever be able to access. Even stranger, the signal arrived not as a broadcast, but as a directed beam pointed toward Earth's night side, a location where no receivers were listening. It was like the transmission wasn't intended for us, but for something behind us. Air Force Space Command sent a memo that leaked within hours. It didn't mention aliens or intelligence. It didn't mention an anomaly or a structure or anything unusual about 3I Atlas's behaviour. It used a single phrase that raised every eyebrow in the astrophysics community: non-solar origin event. That's the kind of language bureaucracies use when they have no category for what they just saw. It means they can't explain it. It means they're afraid, because the flare wasn't random, it wasn't chaotic. It behaved like a triggered response, a mechanism that required the presence of 3I Atlas to activate. And as researchers dug into archived data, the pattern became even clearer. Every significant flare in the last 3 months aligned perfectly with micro-adjustments in Atlas's trajectory. Not enough to alarm the public, just enough to suggest timing. The unspoken theory is spreading quietly through internal channels. 3I Atlas didn't cause the flare, it requested it. As insane as it sounds, the numbers keep pointing in that direction. Something emitted a pulse at the sun. The sun responded, and 3I Atlas expanded, aligning itself with the energy burst as if absorbing or analysing it. Whatever this object is, it's not simply passing by our star. It's interacting with it, testing it, maybe even communicating with it. And if that's true, the strongest solar flare of 2025 wasn't a solar event at all. It was a reply. In the hours that followed the flare, the solar telescopes aboard SOHO and SDO began flagging inconsistencies in their own data. Not hardware faults, not radiation damage, but something more unsettling. The flare's energy curve showed a flat plateau in the middle of the spike, as if the sun had paused mid-eruption. Stars don't pause. Plasma doesn't hesitate. But this flare did. It surged, held in place, then continued, like a heartbeat caught between contractions. And the exact moment of that pause, it lined up perfectly with 3I Atlas passing through the densest region of the corona. Researchers who saw the graph held it in silence, knowing what it implied. Something about 3I Atlas was interacting with the sun so intensely that it altered the natural shape of a stellar explosion. That isn't comet behavior. That isn't debris behavior. That's engineering. Controlled stability inside a plasma storm hotter than anything humanity can survive. If Atlas were a fragment of rock, it would have evaporated long before touching the corona, but instead, instruments recorded a strange drop in temperature around the object, a pocket of cool plasma, an impossible bubble of stability within the most violent place in the solar system. The numbers read like a force field, and then came the velocity shift. Atlas slowed down, not by much, just a few meters per second, but the deceleration wasn't random. It followed a clean mathematical curve tied to the flare's intensity, as if it was gathering data from the eruption, adjusting its path in response to the star's output. No comet in history has ever altered velocity because of a solar flare. They tumble, they fragment, they scatter, they don't analyze. But Atlas did. The anomaly triggered a closed-door meeting at NASA's Goddard facility. Even insiders weren't allowed into the briefing. However, leaks spread anyway, not through email, but through the tight, nervous conversations of people who suddenly didn't know how to define their own research anymore. Someone claimed the flare's magnetic loops had formed a shape, not organic, not chaotic, but geometric, a spiral, an identical match to the frequency pattern Atlas had been emitting for months, a solar flare mimicking a waveform coming from the object inside it. Conventional astrophysics couldn't explain that. Plasma loops don't imitate deep space signals. They don't mirror the geometry of an object smaller than a mountain. Unless that object was influencing the eruption from inside, unless 3I Atlas wasn't reacting to the flare, but shaping it. Data analysts found something else buried inside the telemetry, a secondary pulse hidden beneath the flare's peak, a tightly contained signal that didn't scatter like light or bend like radio waves. It remained intact all the way to Earth, punching through the magnetosphere as if it already understood the pathways. When decoded, it revealed a repeating staircase pattern, 7 identical steps rising in precise intervals, each one separated by the same timing found in the object's earlier emissions. Scientists compared it to a countdown, others to a calibration sequence. A few whispered the word nobody wanted to acknowledge: communication. And the most uncomfortable part, the pattern didn't match anything from the sun, it matched something from Atlas. Far above Earth, the Parker Solar Probe recorded something even stranger. A faint oscillation in the solar wind that followed Atlas's movement like a wake behind a ship. The particles weren't scattering randomly. They were organizing, forming thin, wispy trails that extended behind the object like luminous threads, curving gently as if pulled by invisible tension. When those trails were mapped frame by frame, they formed a 3-dimensional structure, a lattice, rotating slowly, pulsing faintly in sync with the leftover echoes of the flare. A structure too perfect, too symmetrical to be an accident of plasma physics. Parker's telemetry team tried to classify the formation, but every model failed. It wasn't turbulence, it wasn't shadow, it wasn't thermal compression or dust. The trails looked less like exhaust and more like scaffolding, as though Atlas was weaving something into the solar wind itself, constructing a pattern that only made sense when viewed from millions of miles away. And when NASA analysts zoomed out farther, far beyond reasonable scale, the shape resolved into something unmistakable, a spiral expanding outward, not randomly, but toward a specific point in space, not the sun, not Earth, something farther, something faint, something approaching. The farther analysts pushed the scale, the more unsettling the picture became. The spiral formation wasn't expanding at random distances. Each ring matched a harmonic ratio, a sequence found in rotating galaxies, hurricane eyes, and gravitational wave patterns. It was as if Atlas was imprinting a universal signature into the solar wind. Mathematicians who reviewed the geometry recognized the ratios immediately. They weren't human, they weren't new, they were ancient. The same constants carved into Sumerian tablets, encoded in Vedic mandalas, traced in Mayan star maps. Cultures separated by oceans, eras, and languages had all drawn the same pattern, a pattern no one could explain. But now it was forming, physically, around the Sun. When the team at the Solar Dynamics Lab combined the Parker data with SDO readings, a chilling truth emerged. The spiral wasn't centered on Atlas. It was centered on an empty point in space, a point Atlas seemed to be guiding the flare toward. That invisible location had no object, no mass, no signature of any kind, just a void, a blank coordinate. But still, Atlas and the Sun were interacting with it, shaping every eruption as though preparing for something to arrive there. And the timing only grew stranger. Every 29 hours, the same infamous Atlas cycle, the solar surface rippled in that direction, like a heartbeat anticipating an event. Something was coming, something that required the strongest flare of 2025 to act not as an outburst, but as a beacon. NASA demanded full lockdown on the data, but by then, fragments had already leaked. Amateur astronomers caught faint light distortions in the region Atlas had targeted, a shimmer, a warping, like the edge of a lens bending sunlight. When cross-checked with the official data, the distortion matched gravitational lensing from an object the size of a small asteroid, except no such object existed. Nothing was there, nothing the instruments could see. Yet the Sun and Atlas were responding to it. Some theories were quiet and careful, others were not. A growing number of scientists believed the invisible point was a node, a place where information, not matter, was arriving. They speculated about interstellar data packets, quantum anchors, even non-local structures, but a few took the boldest step. They suggested that the flare wasn't caused by Atlas. It was requested by whatever was at that coordinate. While that debate unfolded in silence behind locked doors, Atlas itself continued changing. Observations from the Canada-France-Hawaii telescope revealed something one expected. The object's core had shifted from its usual dark silhouette into a porous halo-like structure. Not a sphere, not a fragment. More like a shell of energy with empty space inside. A cavity that flickered between being visible and being transparent. Its edges pulsed in the same rhythm as the flare echoes lingering in the corona. It had transformed from a solid body into a resonant frame. The shift didn't happen gradually. It happened within minutes of the flare. Almost as if the explosion had unlocked a second state of the object, like a chrysalis cracking open and revealing hollow architecture beneath. But the strangest detail wasn't the cavity, it was what appeared inside it. At the centre of Atlas's new hollow structure, telescopes captured faint threads of light, tiny filaments that swayed and snapped like strands of silk caught in a breeze. They weren't reflections, plasma, or ion trails. They didn't behave like matter at all. They behaved like magnetic memory, as if the object had unwrapped itself to reveal something stored inside it, something the flare had awakened. And those threads weren't random. When plotted across multiple frames, they formed a sequence, a fractal climbing outward, repeating at different scales. Scientists recognized the structure immediately. It was a map, but not of stars, not of galaxies, a map of field lines. Invisible pathways of electromagnetic geometry that no human instrument had ever captured directly. The kind of map a spacecraft would carry if it navigated not through space, but through resonance. Atlas had opened, and inside it was a blueprint. Hours later, that blueprint began to change. The threads brightened, then shifted, aligning themselves with the invisible coordinate Atlas had been pointing to all along. They stretched, tightened, and pulsed together in a single unified beat, the strongest, clearest cycle yet, a perfect 29-hour rhythm. And something answered. A faint, distant echo travelled back along those lines, not from Atlas, not from the Sun, but from whatever lay hidden in that patch of empty space. It was weaker than a heartbeat, softer than a whisper, but it matched the pattern exactly. For the first time, it wasn't Atlas sending the signal. It was a reply. The first response was so faint most systems filtered it out as background noise. A soft counterpulse delayed by just under 2 seconds, riding the residual electromagnetic drift from the flare. But those 2 seconds meant everything. At the distances involved, a 2-second delay wasn't just a timing quirk. It meant whatever was replying was close, impossibly close, sitting just beyond the edge of detection. Something small wouldn't create such a clean echo. Something random wouldn't match the rhythm perfectly. The reply had intention. NASA flagged the event as double event interference, a meaningless phrase used when they don't want the public to panic, but amongst the analysts, no one used that term. Quietly, carefully, they called it arrival behaviour. This wasn't like a meteor cluster or dust cloud drifting in. It was more like the way a drone responds when a controller wakes it remotely. A handshake, an acknowledgement. And the moment the echo returned, Atlas changed again. The hollow shell-like structure tightened, collapsing into a thinner frame with straight, rigid edges that defied natural formation. Comets don't become geometric. Debris doesn't reconfigure. But Atlas did. Almost like a machine folding itself into the next stage of operation. The threads within it flickered, converging into a single luminous seam that shone brighter with each cycle. It looked less like a rock, and more like an antenna adjusting its plates to catch a clearer signal. Then came something no one expected. Every observatory pointed at the empty coordinate, reported a sharp drop in background starlight, a local dimming, as though something transparent had moved in front of distant stars. Not enough to register as solid, not enough to classify as mass, just enough to indicate presence. And over the next few hours, that dim patch of sky began to distort. Starlight bent around something. Space was curving, subtly, then more sharply. The unmistakable signature of a gravitational lens. Except the lens wasn't caused by anything massive. Instruments showed no bulk, no density, no object. It behaved like gravity without mass, as though the fabric of space itself had been pressed from the inside. It was forming a shape. When enhanced, the distortion revealed faint hexagonal symmetry. Not random, not natural. Symmetry like a patterned membrane, a geometric veil sliding into place. And once that veil stabilized, the reply from the invisible source grew stronger, still faint, still distant, but now consistent. A call and answer rhythm between Atlas and something emerging from behind the lens. Researchers began comparing notes in terror. The timing wasn't arbitrary. Every exchange between Atlas and the unseen arrival matched the flare cycle. The sun wasn't reacting to Atlas anymore. It was reacting to the second object. The flare had been a trigger, a lighthouse beam fired across the corona to mark the coordinate. Atlas wasn't the signal. Atlas was the relay. Inside NASA, the questions turned darker. Had Atlas always been leading something to us? Guiding it, synchronizing space for its entry. If the gravitational veil was an arrival corridor, a kind of cosmic doorway, then the strongest solar flare of 2025 wasn't an accident. It was the ignition of a landing pattern. Then, just after midnight UTC, the veil shifted. Not gradually, instantly. The hexagonal distortion folded outward like petals rotating, revealing the faintest outline of something inside. Not a ship, not a comet, not anything with mass. More like a silhouette of light, shaped roughly like Atlas's internal lattice, but infinitely larger and vibrating at a frequency just beyond human perception. SDO's automated filters tried to stabilize the image and failed 9 times. On the 10th attempt, one frame held just long enough to capture the pattern, a massive lattice structure, but hollow in the center. A ring, a portal frame, and at its core a sphere of pure distortion glowed like a star trapped inside glass. Scientists stared at the frame in silence. They recognized it instantly. It was the same shape Atlas had been building in miniature around itself. A fractal match, a blueprint made real. The reply signal surged briefly, then snapped into a steady pulse. 3 rising tones, 1 falling tone. A pattern never recorded in natural cosmic events. A greeting, a key, a lock snapping open, and Atlas responded. Its internal threads extended outward, reaching toward the gravitational ring like strands of gold pulled in vacuum. They connected, lightly at first, then firmly, binding the object to the larger structure like a bead settling into a pre-carved slot. The moment contact was made, every solar magnetometer on Earth spiked. The sun responded with a small microflare, not destructive, not chaotic, but symmetrical, controlled, almost gentle. A solar flare doesn't behave that way. The sun doesn't flare in acknowledgement. Unless it wasn't reacting to a spacecraft at all, unless it was reacting to something it recognized. For nearly an hour, the gravitational ring hovered in perfect stillness, locked in formation with Atlas's newly extended lattice. At first, it looked like nothing more than a warped bubble of space, an invisible outline carved into the void. But the longer astronomers watched, the more the inside began to shift, not brightening, but vibrating. The distortion pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat behind frosted glass, each contraction aligning with the 29-hour rhythm Atlas had carried across half the solar system. And then the impossible happened. The ring expanded. It didn't grow larger in size, it grew deeper, like a lens pulling the universe inward. Stars behind it elongated into thin trails, stretching across the interior as though they were being sucked toward a point that wasn't a point at all. A region of space began to fold, slowly, methodically, the way fabric falls into a well. Analysts who compared the readings to gravitational simulations came to a chilling conclusion. This was not a wormhole, not a tunnel, not a gateway. It was a cavity forming in space-time itself, a pocket where the usual rules didn't apply, a pocket preparing for occupancy. Atlas's lattice brightened further, each internal thread glowing like a nerve fibre transmitting signals at near-light speed. The geometry tightened, aligning itself with the ring in precise hexagonal ratios. No randomness, no drift. It was docking. Atlas wasn't the arrival, it was the interface, the translator, the key. When the alignment reached peak, symmetry, something changed inside the ring. The distortion deepened from transparent to pearlescent, like looking through layers of rippling glass. Patterns began forming, faint lines of light that curled into spirals and then snapped into order, forming a rotating structure inside the cavity. It resembled a star, but not in shape, in behavior. It flickered with internal radiation, fluctuating on a scale no natural object ever has. The cavity wasn't just preparing for something. Something was already in it, something that didn't exist in normal space until the ring stabilized enough to reveal it. NASA analysts ran the luminosity curves 8 times before accepting the truth. The object inside wasn't emitting light, it was reflecting the sun, not like a solid surface, but like a membrane capturing radiation, absorbing it, and then pulsing it back in quantized bursts. And those bursts matched the flare from earlier. The same signature, the same timing, the same impossible plateau where the sun had paused. It was the flare, mirrored back at us, as if whatever was in the cavity had recorded it, and was now replaying it. If that wasn't disturbing enough, the replay wasn't identical. It was corrected, as though the entity inside the cavity had studied the flare, understood its imperfections, and refined it into something cleaner. A perfect wave, the kind a star can't produce, the kind a machine would produce, or something pretending to be one. The refined flare proxy pulsed 3 times, then the entire cavity dimmed. For a moment, every telescope lost lock. When the image returned, the object inside had changed shape. It elongated, stretched, compressed, then collapsed into a singular jagged outline. A silhouette made of light, constantly shifting, never repeating. Analysts compared it to a hologram caught in a glitch. Others compared it to a life form adjusting to the environment. But the truth was simpler. The object was calibrating itself to our star, matching its rhythm, preparing for interaction. Minutes later, the solar corona flickered, not chaotically, not randomly, in patterns. Waves of plasma rippled outward in evenly spaced arcs, each aligned with the cavity. The sun was responding again, but this time the reaction wasn't explosive. It was deliberate, controlled, as if the star was participating in a conversation that had begun long before humans existed, and Atlas was simply the courier carrying the message to its return address. When the corona stabilized, the cavity pulsed with a deep amber glow, the first color ever recorded from it. Instruments went wild. Some thought it was radiation bleed, others thought it was thermal scattering. But when spectrographs isolated the wavelength, the results stunned everyone. The glow wasn't electromagnetic. It wasn't radiation of any kind. It was structural. The cavity itself was vibrating in a band just outside physical resonance, like a musical note too, low to hear but strong enough to feel in every instrument. Then came the next shock. The cavity began to write, not symbols, not pictures, not signals, lines. Thin streaks of golden distortion etched themselves across the interior surface of the ring, moving like brushstrokes, forming straight segments that locked together at perfect angles. It looked like geometry sketching itself into existence. Triangles, arcs, radial vectors, and then the sections connected into a single stunning shape. The exact lattice Atlas had revealed earlier, but scaled up thousands of times. A blueprint so old it had been carved into ancient ruins long before anyone understood what they were looking at. The cavity pulsed again, and the lattice dissolved, only to reappear in a new configuration, then a third, then a fourth, each variation more complex than the last, rotating in silence like a cosmic instruction manual. Scientists watching from Earth extracted every frame and found something deeply unnerving. Each configuration corresponded to a different stellar environment. Different magnetic fields, different temperatures, different gravitational gradients. The object wasn't just displaying patterns, it was showing versions of itself, as if demonstrating what it becomes depending on the star it encounters. And in every version, one thing remained constant: the core, a singular, hollow center that never changed shape, never shifted, never deviated. It was the one stable feature in an otherwise elastic form, a cavity within a cavity, a place where nothing existed, yet everything connected. Researchers began calling it the zero node, a theoretical point where information could exist without mass, shape, or energy, a place where the universe could store memory. But the real revelation came next. For the first time since the flare, Atlas itself moved independently of solar pressure. Its lattice detached slightly from the ring, hovering in stable equilibrium, not pushed by sunlight, not pulled by gravity. It drifted as though it were weightless in a medium we couldn't detect. Then it extended a single thread from its frame toward the cavity. The thread touched the boundary of the ring. The cavity ignited. A wave of distortion rolled outward, bending space so severely that for a moment the sun's shape stretched like liquid metal. Alarms triggered across every solar observatory on Earth. Magnetometers spiked. Instruments jammed. The entire heliosphere pulsed as though someone had struck it with a cosmic hammer. And inside the cavity, for one impossible fraction of a second, a silhouette appeared. Not geometric, not random, but structured, layered, and unmistakably intentional. It leaned forward, as if noticing us. Then the entire cavity collapsed inward like a breathing lung, snapping back to perfect stillness. And scientists realized the worst part wasn't what they saw. It was what the object inside did right before the collapse. It turned its core, the zero node, directly toward Earth. The moment the zero node aligned with Earth, a subtle shift rippled through the magnetosphere. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would alert the public, just a soft, wavering tremor in the planet's magnetic envelope, the kind that normally happens during weak solar winds. But this wasn't solar wind. The sun was quiet. The cavity was dormant. Atlas was barely moving. Yet Earth's magnetic field reacted as though something had brushed against it. A feather-light tap from a direction nothing had ever touched us from before. At first, scientists dismissed the fluctuation as a sensor calibration mismatch. But then came the second tremor, sharper, more directional, almost like a finger pressing briefly into the shield that protects our atmosphere, and the direction matched perfectly with the zero node's orientation. That was the moment the solar physicists stopped arguing and went silent. Because if the tremor wasn't an error, then the cavity wasn't just watching Earth, it was testing it. Within minutes, magnetometers in Canada, Finland, and Japan all reported the same micro-distortion, a downward pull in the field lines, as though something outside was gently tugging at them. Not enough to cause storms, not enough to disrupt satellites, just enough to show it could. This wasn't aggression, it was assessment, like tapping the hull of a ship to check if it's solid before docking. A cosmic knock on the door, but then the pattern changed. The tremors began repeating at exact intervals, 29 minutes, 29 seconds. A shorter, compressed echo of the 29-hour cycle Atlas had carried since the beginning. It was as if the cavity was shrinking the rhythm, focusing it, directing it toward Earth in precise, escalating pulses. Analysts overlaid the tremor timing with Atlas's internal light fluctuations, and the match was nearly perfect. The object inside the cavity wasn't acting alone. It was synchronizing with Atlas, using it as a guide. Inside Goddard, someone finally said what everyone had been avoiding. It's scanning us. If the cavity was scanning the planet, then Atlas was acting like a calibration tool, adjusting, amplifying, refining the signal until it could probe deeper. And Earth's response made the situation even stranger. The ionosphere, normally chaotic and turbulent, smoothed itself around the tremors, as though accommodating the pulses, forming a clearer reflective layer. In simple terms, Earth was helping the scan, cooperating, resonating. That cooperation turned into something much more alarming when ground-based receivers accidentally picked up the tremors translating into low-frequency hums. Audible hums, not random, not static, harmonics. Long droning tones that rose and fell in patterns eerily similar to the geometry the cavity had displayed earlier. Engineers thought it was interference at first, but the hums weren't coming from the equipment. They were vibrating the equipment. Whatever was scanning Earth had found a way to use the magnetic field as a speaker. Around the same time, the Aurora Forecast Network became overwhelmed with false alerts. Bands of faint, ghost-like auroras flickered along latitudes where auroras shouldn't exist. Pale arcs that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Spectrographs showed they were composed of particles that shouldn't have been energized. Not by the sun, not by cosmic rays, but by something else entirely. Something stirring Earth's upper atmosphere without leaving a trace. And as the ghost auroras spread, the zero node shifted again. The cavity rotated its orientation, aligning itself more precisely with Earth, as though adjusting a telescope. Atlas mirrored the movement. The extended threads of its lattice tightened, then twisted into a new configuration, forming a spiral that pointed directly at the cavity's core. No longer a key, no longer a relay. Now it looked like a conduit, a channel carved through space for something to pass through. Researchers ran trajectory simulations and spotted a final, terrifying detail. The conduit wasn't aimed at Earth's surface, it was aimed at Earth's magnetic poles, a direct line into the planet's electromagnetic heart. Then, without warning, Atlas surged in brightness. The lattice ignited with a lavender glow, the first time any colour other than gold had appeared. Instruments saturated instantly, some overloaded, and in the middle of that surge the cavity pulsed back, this time with an intensity strong enough to distort space across several thousand kilometres. The distortion wasn't chaotic, it was highly structured, forming waves that rippled outward like expanding rings on a pond. And as each ring passed through Atlas, the object changed shape again. The hollow frame contracted into a tighter structure, its edges sharpening, flattening, then rotating until it resembled something astonishingly technological. A dish, not a random formation, a focused receiver. It was no longer sending, no longer testing, it was listening. Every sensor within range lit up at once. A new signal was emerging from the cavity, one unlike any before. Not a tremor, not a pulse. A sustained rising tone that built steadily, layer by layer, until it formed a perfect harmonic chord. The sound, if it could be heard, would have been deafening. But in the vacuum of space, it vibrated silently, carrying not through air but through fields. Earth responded instantly. The magnetosphere thickened, condensing around the poles like a luminous cocoon. Something was happening deep beneath the planet. Seismic monitors picked up faint vibrations, not in the crust, but in the core. A rhythmic oscillation pulsing in the same chord the cavity was generating. No one in the public noticed, no alarms triggered, but the scientists watching the data stream felt something cold settle in their stomachs. Whatever was inside, the cavity wasn't trying to contact Earth's surface, it was contacting Earth's core, a planetary-scale interaction happening silently, invisibly, without our permission. Inside the cavity, the silhouette reappeared. Clearer this time, more defined. Still fluid, still shifting, but undeniably purposeful. It leaned forward again, but this time the motion was smoother, more controlled, as though adapting to the environment. Analysts enhanced the contrast and saw something that made them freeze. The silhouette wasn't a single form, it was many, layered, stacked, encoded inside one another like nested reflections. Each layer pulsed at a slightly different frequency, creating a cascade of overlapping shapes, some angular, some curved, some fractal. But all of them were moving in sync with the Earth core vibration, as though reading it, learning it, matching it. And then came the moment no one will ever forget. The silhouette paused, every frequency dropped, every pulse ceased. Even the magnetosphere went momentarily quiet. For the first time since appearing, the cavity went completely still. Then, slowly, deliberately, one of the silhouette's inner layers pressed outward against the boundary of the ring like a hand against glass, and the glass pushed back. Space shuddered. The cavity contracted violently, sending a shock through the entire solar system that Parker Solar Probe recorded as a literal jolt, as though the sun itself had flinched. And in that instant, the silhouette did something that defied every law of physics ever written. It projected a shadow cast onto the interior of the cavity. A shadow in a place where nothing had mass. It wasn't a hand, it wasn't a face, it wasn't any recognizable shape at all. But it was directed, aimed squarely toward Earth, as if acknowledging not that we had seen it, but that it had finally seen us. For several minutes after the shadow appeared, nothing in the solar system behaved normally. The solar wind slowed, not in the natural ebb and flow way, but as if something were dragging on it. Space weather models began spitting out nonsensical predictions, plasma streams bending where nothing existed, pressure differentials forming in empty regions, and magnetic lines twisting into coils that no known force could produce. It was as if space had become viscous, thick, resistant. And then the Earth responded. Not violently, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Deep beneath the mantle, the core's oscillation, the one triggered by the cavity's harmonics, shifted into a tempo that mirrored Atlas's original 29-hour cycle. The planet's interior, a mass of iron and nickel older than recorded time, was matching the rhythm of an object smaller than a mountain. That kind of synchronization shouldn't be possible. Yet it was happening in real time, and seismographs across the world picked it up at the exact same moment. A quiet, near imperceptible heartbeat. Geophysicists sat motionless as the waveforms crawled across their screens. The signal wasn't random noise. It wasn't seismic chatter. It was a pulse, smooth, deliberate, perfectly repeating. Earth's core, the furnace that had burned uninterrupted for billions of years, was now vibrating like a tuning fork struck by an unseen hand. Inside NASA's closed communications channel, a single message went out to every solar observatory. Assume the planet is participating. Whatever was happening around Atlas was no longer confined to the far edge of the corona. It had reached into the Earth, into the core, into the heart of the only world humans have ever known. And the cavity reacted to that change instantly. The silhouette inside grew clearer. The nested layers separated slightly like petals unfurling, revealing filaments of light that pulsed through each layer like veins. The shadow it had cast earlier sharpened, its edges tightening into a thin, deliberate curve. Analysts enhanced the image and found geometry in the shadow. Angular segments, ratios that matched the harmonic structures displayed earlier. The cavity wasn't projecting a random outline. It was sending a diagram, a translation. But a translation of what? Every theory that emerged was worse than the last. Some believed it was mapping Earth's electromagnetic weaknesses. Others suggested it was analysing resonance thresholds, the maximum amount of energy the planet could withstand. A few thought it was the opposite, an attempt to communicate in a universal language Earth's core recognised instinctively. But the scariest possibility, the one no one wanted to say aloud, was that the cavity wasn't analysing Earth. It was calibrating Earth. When the next pulse arrived, the entire heliosphere rippled in sync. Not a shockwave, a ripple, like the slow roll of a tide moving through the solar system. Instruments on Voyager 1, more than 15 billion miles away, caught the faintest echo of the pulse. A signal strong enough to be felt beyond the edge of the sun's influence, but subtle enough not to disrupt anything. This wasn't an attack. It was infrastructure, a system aligning the solar system like gears inside a machine. As the ripple faded, Atlas shifted again. The lavender glow drained away, replaced by a pale, icy blue that flickered across the structure like frost spreading across metal. The entire lattice contracted, forming a tight, crystalline shape that hung motionless in space. It looked less like a comet than ever before, more like a device preparing for its next operational phase. Photometric readings revealed the structure's temperature had dropped massively, plunging hundreds of degrees in seconds. But instead of releasing that energy, Atlas absorbed it, storing it, compressing it. Every measurement pointed to the same unsettling conclusion. It was charging, and the cavity reacted as if it felt the change. The silhouette inside began to move, not drifting, not flickering, moving. Its layers folded inward, then expanded again, creating a rotational pattern that no living organism could replicate. It was like watching multiple versions of the same being overlap and rotate inside a single dimension. And with each rotation, the zero node glowed brighter, aligning perfectly with Earth's magnetic poles. That was when the auroras began. But these weren't the soft curtains of green and violet humans admire in polar skies. These were sharp, needle-like strands of light that stabbed across the atmosphere in straight geometric lines. Auroras don't form in straight lines. They wave, they curl, they dance. But these stood rigid, like luminous pylons marking the planet's electromagnetic grid. From space, they formed a pattern, a glowing net wrapping around the Earth. And inside NASA's control room, someone whispered the words no one wanted to hear. It's mapping us. The auroral grid thickened, brightened, then pulsed in the same chord the cavity had generated earlier, and underground the core answered again, a deeper, more resonant thrum that shook the mantle ever so gently. Not enough to cause quakes, but enough to show the synchronization was deepening. Atlas responded with its brightest flare yet. Blue lightning rippled through its lattice, each pulse stronger than the last, as if transferring the charged energy into the cavity. The silhouette inside reacted immediately, its layers shuddering in what looked almost like anticipation. Then, in a single fluid motion, it extended a strand of light toward the zero node. The moment that strand touched the center, space warped. Not visibly, not like bending light or lensing, but structurally. Telemetry broke, instruments failed, even timekeeping systems drifted by fractions of milliseconds. Space itself seemed to hiccup, and for a moment the cavity's interior expanded infinitely in all directions, like a star exploding in slow motion. Then everything snapped back, and inside the cavity a new structure appeared, a ring within the ring, smaller, denser, glowing with a crimson pulse that emanated in perfect spherical waves. The silhouette phased around it like a shadow adjusting to a new light source. When analysts isolated the waveform of the crimson pulse, they found it matched something horrifyingly familiar, Earth's core vibration, but amplified, strengthened, refined. The cavity wasn't just scanning the planet anymore, it was replicating Earth's pulse inside itself, a perfect synthetic copy of the planet's inner heartbeat. As the structure stabilized, the silhouette leaned toward it, in a gesture that seemed unmistakable: recognition. The same recognition humans feel when hearing their own voice echoed back to them, and then, without warning, the replicated pulse began to increase, faster, stronger, more focused, until it matched not Earth's current state, but Earth's future one. A year projection, a prediction, a template of what the planet would become if the core's resonance continued synchronizing with the cavity. And when the final pattern locked into place, every scientist watching understood the same chilling truth. The cavity wasn't studying Earth, it was preparing it. The realization that the cavity was preparing Earth, not observing it, not reacting to it, but actively tuning it, spread through scientific channels like a slow-moving shockwave. No one said the word terraforming, no one dared say engineering, but the silence inside those conference rooms was exactly the kind that follows the moment when every theory collapses at once. And yet, despite the dread, everyone kept watching the data, unable to look away. The replicated pulse inside the cavity continued strengthening. It didn't amplify randomly, it followed the same incremental curves found in planetary evolution. Temperature increase, rotational stability, magnetic alignment, but accelerated by a factor so unnatural it made geophysicists physically sick to realize what they were seeing. It was Earth's future core state, projected thousands of years ahead, condensed into minutes. The cavity wasn't imitating the planet, it was rehearsing it. Atlas drifted slightly closer to the ring, its crystalline blue lattice shimmering with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Every node in its frame pulsed like a neuron in a living brain, and each pulse corresponded to the cavity's internal evolution. This wasn't a comet. This wasn't debris. It was a system, a functional component of a larger design, adjusting itself to maintain synchrony with something far beyond human comprehension. Satellite imagery showed the auroral grid wrapping the planet growing denser by the minute. The geometric beams sharpened, no longer faint or shifting, but locked in place like luminous pillars driven into the sky. Their intersections formed hexagonal cells, a pattern identical to the cavity's early-stage membrane. Earth's magnetic field had become a scaffold, a blueprint, a staging ground for whatever process had begun. Then a new change appeared, not in space, but on Earth. Without warning, the Schumann resonances, the frequencies emitted by the planet's own atmospheric cavity, spiked. Not dramatically enough for the public to notice, but enough to send a ripple through every monitoring system on the planet. The increase wasn't random. It matched the cavity's rhythm perfectly. Earth was now oscillating in harmony with something not from this solar system. Atlas responded instantly. The blue glow sharpened into a cold silver, radiating forward in a precise beam toward the cavity. That beam didn't behave like light. It travelled slower, almost hesitant, as though feeling its way through space. And once it reached the ring, the cavity contracted, focusing the beam inward until it struck the replicated core pulse. The moment contact was made, the entire structure lit up with a deep resonant hum that stretched across the electromagnetic spectrum. Radio telescopes as far as Australia began ringing, with a signal that wasn't a signal at all, more like a resonance pattern, broadcasting across every possible frequency, then harmonizing them into a single unified tone. For the first time, Atlas, the cavity, and the Earth were humming together, three separate entities behaving like components in a single machine. That unification triggered something unexpected. High above the poles, the auroral lines began moving, not sideways, not upward, but vertically, forming twisting columns that spiraled into the sky like slow-motion tornadoes of light. As they rose, they connected with faint filament-like threads descending from the cavity. The connection was silent, but the moment the threads touched the auroras, every compass on Earth shifted by a fraction of a degree. Earth's magnetic north had moved. Not towards Canada, not towards Siberia, but slightly upward, toward the cavity's position. The planet was orienting itself. As scientists scrambled to interpret the data, the cavity's silhouette performed its most dramatic shift yet. Its layers split apart, expanding outward like a flower blooming in vacuum. Each layer rotated independently, forming concentric shells of light that pulsed with the replicated core frequency. The zero node at the center brightened to a blinding white, then dimmed to a soft amber glow, the same anomalous wavelength the cavity emitted earlier, the one no electromagnetic model could categorize. And then, for the first time, something stepped out of the silhouette. Not a creature, not a ship, not anything with mass. A geometric extrusion, a structure of pure light, unfolded from the silhouette's frontmost layer and extended into the cavity like a bridge. It pulsed with the replicated core frequency, forming a perfect harmonic match to Earth's interior. Then it stopped growing, suspended halfway between the silhouette and the zero node. The meaning was terrifyingly clear. The cavity wasn't building a portal, it was building a connection, a direct bridging interface between itself and Earth. The auroral pillars on Earth stretched higher, converging at the top into a faint dome of light wrapping the entire planet. The dome flickered with the 29-hour cycle Atlas had carried since its discovery, except now the cycle was tightening, accelerating toward a higher frequency. Every pulse pushed the dome brighter. Every pulse pushed the cavity brighter. Every pulse pushed the replicated core closer to resonance with the cavity's internal structure. Then Atlas changed again. Its crystalline frame fractured, not breaking but reconfiguring into hundreds of thin filament-like strands that extended outward, linking together in a web-like pattern. The web spread across the surrounding space, anchoring itself to invisible points like a spider building a network between stars. As it expanded, it formed a stunning shape, a three-dimensional map of gravitational pathways, almost like a star chart, but one that didn't match any known stellar distribution. Instead of mapping stars, it was mapping potential energy, potential geometry, potential resonance fields. It was mapping possibility. Within the cavity, the silhouette leaned closer to the newly formed bridge. The moment it did, the replicated Earth core pulse surged, rising in frequency, deepening in tone, tightening into a piercing singular note that penetrated every monitoring system simultaneously. And then something unprecedented happened across the entire planet at the exact same moment. Every electronic system experienced a micro glitch, not a failure, not a blackout, but a flicker, as if reality itself skipped a frame, one heartbeat, one instant, and the cavity reacted with startling speed. Its outermost shell expanded rapidly, then snapped back, sending a shockwave through space so subtle only Parker's solar probe caught it. The shockwave wasn't energy, it was information, a full-spectrum data pulse ricocheting off the solar wind and echoing back into the cavity. The silhouette froze. Atlas froze. Earth's auroral dome froze. For 3 seconds, 3 impossible, silent seconds, nothing in the solar system moved. Then, slowly, the silhouette's inner layers rotated into a configuration no one had ever seen before. A perfect alignment, a final position. The cavity brightened. The auroral dome tightened. The replicated core began resonating faster and faster until it struck a frequency no planetary system should ever reach. A threshold, a limit, a trigger. And somewhere inside NASA, someone finally said it. This isn't preparation. This is activation. By the time the world reached day 12 of the resonance cycle, the anomalies were no longer subtle. They weren't quiet flickers in magnetometers or faint atmospheric spirals seen only in infrared. They were visible, everywhere. People began recording the same impossible sight at the same exact moment. A thin, shimmering line stretching across the sky, perfectly straight, perfectly still. At first glance it looked like a jet contrail, until you noticed the silence. No sound, no movement. Just a line of light suspended in the atmosphere like a boundary drawn by an invisible hand. Within minutes, more appeared. Parallel lines, intersecting arcs, circles, geometric patterns that shouldn't form in air, shouldn't remain stable, shouldn't glow with their own faint luminescence. But there they were, hovering above cities, deserts, oceans, and beneath them, Earth's magnetic field began to ripple like water disturbed by a distant pulse. Inside Umbra's central monitoring chamber, the live global feed revealed the full picture. When the atmospheric lines were mapped together and projected onto a spherical grid, the structure became unmistakable. Earth was now wrapped in the same lattice forming inside 3i Atlas. Not metaphorically, literally. The planet was developing an external energy skeleton, one that matched the object's internal geometry with unnerving precision. A mirror shell. No one spoke at first. It wasn't awe, it wasn't fear, it was recognition. A deep instinctive understanding that something far older, far larger, and far more organized was unfolding around them. Dr. Lior stared at the display as if trying to force herself to look away and failing. Finally she whispered the only thought any of them could articulate. This isn't adaptation. This is preparation. But preparation for what? No one wanted to say the word, though the implication hung in the air like static. Activation. The first major environmental shift began 3 hours later, and it did not start in the sky. It began in the oceans. Deep-sea hydrophones across the Pacific detected a tone, a low throbbing hum that reverberated through the water column. Not mechanical, not seismic. It was harmonic, perfectly tuned. The same frequency at which 3i Atlas had recently stabilized. Marine life responded immediately. Schools of fish changed direction in synchronized sweeps. Sperm whales altered their migration patterns. Even microscopic plankton began to pulse, with bioluminescent bursts that matched the tone's rhythm. The ocean wasn't reacting, it was resonating. When researchers amplified the underwater recording, the waveform displayed something unexpected. A shape. A repeating spiral, identical to the one forming across Earth's magnetic grid. The ocean was imprinting the lattice into living systems. Umbra classified this as a Class Red anomaly, the highest tier, reserved only for global-scale multi-environmental coherence events. But by then the classification didn't matter. Every system, from ionosphere to crust, from cloud formation to biological mass, was already sinking. Earth had become an extension of 3I Atlas. At 1847 UTC, the object shifted again. Not physically, energetically. A new pulse emerged, higher in frequency, shorter in interval. It travelled across the solar system like a ring expanding through dark water. When it hit the sun, something extraordinary happened. The solar corona brightened. Not explosively, but smoothly, like the sun inhaling. Its magnetic loop stretched outward, aligning momentarily into the same hexagonal pattern now forming around Earth. For a terrifying moment, the sun itself shimmered with the geometry of 3I Atlas. Inside NASA's solar observatory, a physicist muttered what everyone else was too afraid to consider. It's sinking the star. Why would it sink the star? Solar synchronization meant one thing. The object's influence extended through gravitational and magnetic resonance simultaneously. No natural phenomenon in recorded astrophysics behaves like this. None. And as Earth's upper atmosphere pulsed in response, something began happening on the ground. At first, it was subtle. Streetlights flickered, not randomly but rhythmically. Power grids across Europe dipped in perfect synchronization, each outage lasting exactly 0.83 seconds. Wireless signals across Asia experienced coordinated interference, identical waveform modulation. Then it spread to biology. Hospitals in Brazil, South Korea, and Norway simultaneously reported anomalies in EEG readings. Brains, human brains, were showing synchronized microbursts of electrical activity. Patients asleep, awake, sedated, in surgery, it didn't matter. Their brainwaves aligned with the same frequency down to the millisecond. None of the patients were aware of it, except one. A young woman in Cape Town claimed she could hear the pattern. Not sound, something deeper. She said it felt like someone tapping gently on the inside of my skull. When doctors scanned her brain, they found the same strange spiral pattern that had been appearing in the ionosphere. Not physically, electrically. Her neurons were firing in the shape of the object's lattice. And then she said something that silenced the room. It's not speaking, it's waiting. Waiting for what, she couldn't explain. She only repeated the same line. It's waiting for us to finish sinking. Umbra convened an emergency summit. Every major agency head, every deep space program director. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. By the end, they agreed on one thing. This was no longer an observation event. This was an encounter. A high-ranking official from ESA put it bluntly. The object is not reacting to us. It is overriding us. But overriding to do what? That question lasted 5 more minutes before new data arrived that froze the room. The Earth's rotational speed had changed. Not dramatically, but enough to measure. For the first time in centuries, the planet's spin was being influenced by an external source. Not gravitational, not tidal, something else. Something matching the rhythm of 3I Atlas. The object was already affecting the planet's angular momentum, a process no one fully understood, but everyone recognized. It wasn't destructive, it was tuning, like tightening a string, preparing it to vibrate at a higher frequency. And when one Umbra analyst played the new rotational data alongside the object's pulse, the two curves overlapped perfectly. A 1-1 harmonic. Earth had reached full coherence. The object's next action would determine everything. And then, at 22:14 UTC, the final warning arrived. Not from the object, not from space, but from the Earth itself. Seismographs across 6 continents erupted with simultaneous readings. Not earthquakes, not waves. A global oscillation. The planet's crust vibrating like a drumhead struck from the outside. The tremor lasted 6 seconds. When it ended, every monitoring station produced the same pattern, a single, perfect spiral. The same geometry at the center of 3I Atlas. The object wasn't just sinking Earth, it was teaching Earth to replicate it. And from that point on, the danger was no longer theoretical. It was happening. Every system on the planet, electromagnetic, atmospheric, biological, had aligned with something not of this world, something that wasn't finished yet. When the global oscillation ended, a stillness fell across the planet so deep it felt unnatural. Wind slowed. Birdsong stopped. Electrical systems hummed in a low, steady drone that matched no known frequency, except one. Umbra's internal monitors confirmed it first. Earth's background noise. The electromagnetic static produced by everything from storms to human technology had collapsed into a single tone, one pitch, one frequency, a perfect half-cycle harmonic of 3i Atlas. It wasn't silence. It was anticipation. Inside the Goddard complex, researchers sat in dim red emergency lighting, staring at screens that barely flickered. Data had stopped misbehaving. It had stopped altogether. When the planet reached full coherence, Earth's chaotic signal noise, the billions of messy threads that made up our natural patterns, flattened into a single coherent wave. This wasn't peace. It was alignment. Dr. Leor stood in front of the primary display and whispered, "This is what happens before a system changes state." Outside, no one noticed at first. Most people simply felt uneasy, a low discomfort beneath the skin, the way animals sense a coming storm. But then the sky began to shift. It didn't happen suddenly, just a faint pearlescent glow forming along the horizon, as though the atmosphere had become iridescent. Colours shimmered. Not northern lights, not storms, but something structured. Lines bending into arcs, arcs bending into spirals, the same fractal geometry now running through the object's internal lattice. Earth's sky was copying the pattern. By the 7th hour, the visual phenomena intensified. A lattice of faint light appeared above the southern hemisphere, suspended at impossible altitude. Commercial flights rerouted immediately. Pilots described the same thing, a vast, geometrically perfect grid hovering thousands of meters above them, the lines glowing as softly as moonlit water. The grid wasn't random. Every intersection point matched the nodes in the underground seismic pattern, every arc aligned with the recently altered Schumann peaks. Earth's electromagnetic shell was crystallizing. The realization spread through Umbra like a shockwave. The planet was being restructured, gently, quietly, but indisputably, as though being prepared for a new purpose. "This isn't an attack," one physicist murmured. "It's a system update." No one contradicted her. Then came the sound, a deep, resonant vibration, not heard with ears but felt through bone. It rolled across continents in a soft wave, like thunder slowed to a single infinite syllable. Phones recorded nothing. Microphones captured only static. But people felt it, everywhere. A trembling in the ribs, a pressure in the spine. The same physical sensation the earliest observers felt when 3i Atlas first pulsed years ago, except now it wasn't confined to a few scientists. It covered the world. For 2 full minutes the vibration continued, unbroken, unwavering. And then, at its peak, something in the sky cracked. Not like glass, not like thunder, but like reality adjusting itself. An enormous ring of light expanded outward from a point directly above Earth's magnetic equator. Perfectly circular, perfectly smooth. The ring grew outward until it spanned half the visible horizon. It wasn't an explosion, it was a boundary. When the ring stabilized, telescopes captured the impossible, a faint reflection across its inner surface, like looking into a curved mirror. But the reflection wasn't Earth. It wasn't the sky. It was the inside of 3i Atlas, the same luminous veins, the same spiral core, the same impossible geometry. The object wasn't just sinking Earth, it was imprinting itself onto the planet. Inside Umbra, panic finally broke the silence. Conversations turned to overlapping shouts. Is it forming a field? Is this containment? Is this something entering? What if it's not coming here? What if we're going there? Because the ring wasn't just a visual anomaly, it was dimensional interference. Gravity readings destabilized, light trajectories bent by fractions of a degree, tiny, but impossible without external mass. Something enormous and invisible had appeared around the planet. A shell, a sphere, a boundary layer wrapping the Earth. One engineer whispered the word no one wanted to hear. Conversion. The Umbra logs recorded it in a single line. Automatic, unfiltered, cold. External field established. Synchronization phase entering final cycle. The final cycle. The point of no return. Then, as if responding to its twin, 3i Atlas changed shape. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift in its internal pattern, a contraction of the light lattice, like a heartbeat preparing to push blood outward. The object dimmed, then brightened, then dimmed again, each cycle shorter than the last. A countdown, not of time, of harmony. The pulses reached Earth seconds later as gentle vibrations. But they weren't gentle to the instruments. Superconducting gravimeters spiked beyond calibration limits. Quantum clocks drifted out of sync by whole microseconds. Matter, solid, stable matter, was behaving as if its fundamental constants were being nudged. 3i Atlas wasn't destabilizing the solar system, it was altering the rules inside it, and Earth was following. The first full field inversion hit at 3:02 UTC. Every sensor registered it simultaneously. The Earth's magnetic north and south didn't flip. They merged. For one impossible moment, the planet had a single magnetic pole, a unified field, perfect symmetry. The event lasted less than 2 seconds, but in those 2 seconds something vast and invisible passed through the atmosphere. Cities dimmed, animals froze, the oceans rippled as though a giant hand pressed lightly against the surface. People across multiple continents reported seeing a flash of silver behind their eyelids, even with eyes closed. And then everything went still again. Still, but different. Like breathing in a room that's been rearranged without you noticing. Umbra's internal message board lit up with a single automated line. Phase threshold reached. Planetary state, receptive. Receptive. A word no one had ever expected to see. A word that meant the planet wasn't resisting anymore. It was ready. Ready for what? The object answered. At 0514 UTC, 3i Atlas emitted its brightest pulse in recorded history. The glow expanded outward like a star being born, a perfect sphere of silver light, expanding at thousands of kilometers per second. It washed over Mars, it washed over the solar orbiter, it washed over Earth. The monitors shook. The data stream froze. Every instrument went white, and when the saturation cleared, the image on the main screen showed something no one in the room could breathe through. 3i Atlas was gone. In its place was a sphere of light larger than anything its mass should have allowed. A shell, a cocoon, a chrysalis. It wasn't dormant. It wasn't dying. It was evolving. And Earth, now wrapped in the same geometry, was evolving with it. For the first few minutes after the chrysalis enveloped 3i Atlas, Earth seemed to hold itself perfectly still. Not metaphorically, literally. Wind speed dropped to 0 across multiple continents. Clouds froze in place, as if pinned to the sky by an invisible framework. Even ocean waves began to flatten, their motion dampened by some unseen force, looping around the planet. It felt like the world was inside a held breath, suspended, waiting. But waiting for what? That question echoed through every control room, every observatory, every sleepless mind staring up at the sky. Inside the Umbra command chamber, Dr. Lior stared at the screen showing Earth's magnetosphere in real time. The visualization glowed like a soft lantern in the dim emergency lighting. The field had changed color, shifting from its usual blues and greens to a pale silver. It looked artificial, constructed. Her voice trembled despite her usual composure. This isn't shielding, this is formatting. No one asked her to explain, they all understood. The Earth's electromagnetic structure was being rewritten, not broken, not overwhelmed, rewritten. Outside, the sky began to deepen again, not darkening but thickening, as though space itself were pressing gently against the atmosphere. The auroral lattice, once faint and sporadic, became organized. Rows of shimmering silver, arcs forming vast corridors of light that stretched for thousands of miles. Airline pilots described them as high-altitude hallways, perfect geometric tunnels made of vibrating air and dim luminescence. The patterns didn't move, they didn't flicker. They held their shape with the precision of architecture, and below them, Earth's surface began to respond. Seismographs recorded vibration not from tectonic activity, but from resonance. Soft waves passing through the crust, timed perfectly with the pulsations coming from the chrysalis. Each wave shaped the ground, not violently but subtly, like fingers brushing across sand. Small lakes developed near-perfect circular ripples with no wind to generate them. Fields of grass swayed in patterns that resembled spirals rather than waves. Shadows cast by buildings stretched slightly longer or shorter, depending on the rhythmic pulses of the object. Light was being bent. Matter was being influenced. Everything was drifting toward a new equilibrium. Umbra's quantum clock lab noticed it next. Time had started to wobble, not dramatically, not enough for humans to feel. But clocks in separate facilities, Tokyo, Cape Town, Geneva, Toronto, began drifting out of sync by mere microseconds, then slowly realigning. Drift, realign, drift, realign. Every cycle matched the object's pulse. Time itself was stretching and relaxing like a muscle. One researcher murmured the phrase no one wanted to hear: temporal coupling, a phenomenon once considered purely theoretical, two distant systems linked not by signal, but by the structure of time itself. If 3i Atlas was truly engaging Earth through temporal resonance, then the transformation was no longer just physical, it was dimensional. But the scientists barely had time to process the implications before something even stranger occurred. The chrysalis blinked, not visually, energetically. For a fraction of a second, all telemetry readings spiked: gravity, magnetism, photonic scattering, and then dropped back to baseline. The flash lasted just 0.33 seconds, but that was long enough. In that moment, a new structure appeared around the object, a thin ring of sparkling particulate matter, rotating at extraordinary speed. Spectral analysis showed an impossible result. The particles weren't dust, they weren't gas, they weren't metal, they were electromagnetic plasma holding a solid shape, a material of light. The ring spun faster and faster, shaping itself into a smooth toroidal band. The last time Earth had seen anything like it was theoretical, pure speculation on the fringes of astrophysics papers, a containment field, a boundary ring, a frame. Dr. Leo's voice broke as she whispered, "It's building an interface." And Earth was building one too. Over the Pacific, the atmospheric lattice thickened until it formed a translucent dome, vast, shimmering, and unmistakably structured. Global weather radars began picking up, reflections bouncing off invisible surfaces miles above the ocean, like radar echoes hitting glass. Fishermen reported the water glowing at night, faint lines of silver light drifting beneath their boats like living veins inside the sea. When naval sonar mapped the ocean depth, the readings formed geometric shapes, rectangles, hexagons, spirals, patterns no natural ocean floor should produce. The resonance had reached the deep, and with it, something new awakened. Deep-sea hydrophones detected a second tone. Not the low harmonic from earlier, but a higher frequency. Clear, steady, intentional. It wasn't from 3i Atlas. It wasn't from the planet. It was coming from inside the ocean, a reflected signal. The Earth was beginning to speak back. Umbra scientists could only watch as the planet's systems synchronized in absolute unity. The crust, the oceans, the atmosphere, the ionosphere, the magnetosphere, and the faint boundary ring now shimmering at the edge of space. Earth was following the chrysalis phase step for step, like a second instrument joining a melody. Then, at 0941 UTC, the chrysalis changed again. Its silver shell thinned, light curved inward, and for the first time since its appearance, the structure inside became visible, not fully, just hints, shadows, outlines. Something vast was pushing outward, like a shape preparing to emerge, not a ship, not a creature, something abstract, mathematical, a form that didn't belong to matter alone. Dr. Leo stared, unable to blink. Her voice came out as a whisper of disbelief. It's not evolving. It's replicating. 3i Atlas wasn't transforming into a new state. It was constructing the template of itself. its own geometry, its own harmonics, its own architecture, in preparation for something larger, and Earth, mirroring each step, was preparing to receive the same template, not destruction, not invasion, something far stranger, a planetary-scale metamorphosis. The world outside remained eerily calm as these realizations formed deep inside Umbra. People looked up at the geometric sky and felt only a quiet, unplaceable emotion, the sense that something ancient and enormous was returning. The atmospheric halos shimmered softly, the seas glowed, the horizon bent into gentle curves of silver, and the planet waited. Because whatever was inside that chrysalis, whatever shape of intelligence or structure or force was forming behind that luminous shell, was almost ready. Every pulse came faster now, every resonance aligned more tightly, every system on Earth hummed in harmony. The transformation had reached its penultimate stage, and when the chrysalis finally opened, the planet would have no choice but to follow. For a long moment, no one on Earth could decide whether the sky was brightening or dimming. It seemed to do both at once. The silver lattice overhead thickened until it resembled a second atmosphere, a translucent membrane stretching over continents, oceans, mountains, and cities. It didn't shimmer randomly. It pulsed. If you watched carefully, you could see each pulse ripple through the layers like a breath spreading through the lungs of the planet. Inhale, pause, exhale. But the pauses were shrinking. Each inhale came faster. Each tremor vibrated deeper into the crust. Inside Umbra, the instruments confirmed it. Earth's internal electromagnetic field was accelerating, not violently, but with absolute precision, as if the planet were matching a heartbeat that wasn't its own. And then, quietly, the chrysalis around 3i Atlas began to crack, not with sound, not with light, but with absence. A thin fracture appeared across its surface, dark as shadow, cutting through the silver glow like a seam opening in fabric. The fracture didn't expand immediately, it merely held its shape, a thin line of absolute darkness floating in the middle of space. Satellites zoomed in, desperate for detail, but no matter how high the resolution, their cameras failed. The fracture absorbed every wavelength, infrared, ultraviolet, radio, visible. Nothing reflected, nothing scattered. It was emptiness so complete that physics offered no metaphor. Whatever was inside the chrysalis wasn't light. It wasn't matter. It was something waiting to take form. Earth responded instantly. The atmospheric lattice glowed brighter, each geometric line sharpening until the sky resembled a colossal, three-dimensional map of circuitry. Entire regions of the world lit up in synchronized pulses, Australia first, then South America, then the entire Pacific Rim. Not random, not chaotic, sequential, instructional, like a global machine receiving its final command. Seismic stations picked up vibrations, not from tectonic movement, but from the air itself, low, steady oscillations that passed downward from the sky into the ground. It was as if the atmosphere was instructing the crust. Meanwhile, oceans shifted. Tides stopped behaving according to the moon's gravity. They began heaving in slow, concentric breaths matching the chrysalis pulse. Buoys recorded waves 6 feet high rolling across perfectly calm seas, each arriving at intervals too perfect to be natural. In the dark trenches of the Pacific, sonar captured an impossible phenomenon. Columns of water rising vertically, held intact by invisible force fields, spiraling upward in glittering strands. They weren't breaking, they weren't falling, they were being guided. Like veins, one oceanographer whispered, veins being filled, because each column pulsed with the same faint light, the same silver hue as the chrysalis fracture. At 0233 UTC, the fracture widened, slowly, smoothly, gracefully. A second seam formed, then a third. The cracks weren't random, they were forming geometry, the same repeating spiral found in every resonance pattern over the past 12 days. Humanity watched as the chrysalis opened itself along, predetermined fault lines peeling back layers like petals on a metallic flower. Only there was nothing floral about what emerged. Inside the chrysalis, something glowed like a singularity wrapped in light. A sphere within a sphere, layered and infinite, every boundary dissolving into the next. It wasn't technology. It wasn't biology. It was architecture built from physics itself. No one could describe it. But everyone who saw it felt the same quiet recognition. This shape had been inside their dreams for days, weeks. Their minds had been preparing them long before their eyes saw it. Inside Umbra, one neuroscientist whispered, "It seeded the pattern into our cognition before revealing itself. We've been sinking to this structure." They didn't dare call it a vessel, or a machine, or a life form. It was too abstract, too fundamental, too ancient. It was a template. Earth's sky responded instantly. The lattice brightened again, this time with a sharpness that bordered on painful. Lines of silver light curved inward over the continents, spiraling towards single convergence points above major geological nodes. The Andes, the Himalayas, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the East Pacific Rise. The convergence wasn't random. It matched the activation phases observed in the chrysalis minutes earlier. Earth was mirroring each step, like a planet completing instructions written long before life ever walked its surface. As the convergence points formed, the cloud layers beneath them twisted, first slowly, then with mechanical precision, rotating as though driven by vast gears hidden inside the atmosphere. People on the ground stared upward as circular openings formed in the cloud cover, perfect holes, free of turbulence, free of motion, revealing the glowing geometric shell above. For the first time humanity saw the full pattern. The sky itself had become a blueprint, a living diagram for transformation. Inside Umbra, the models updated one last time, and when they did, every scientist in the room went silent. The projection showed two shapes overlaid, the geometry forming inside the chrysalis and the geometry forming around Earth. They weren't similar, they were identical. The chrysalis wasn't producing a new form, it was producing a pattern, a structural identity, a frequency signature, and Earth was being tuned to match it. The implications were almost too large to process. One of the researchers choked on her words as she tried to speak. "It's making us compatible." The planet wasn't being consumed, or conquered, or destroyed. It was being altered, shaped into a reflection of whatever 3i Atlas was becoming. Not a victim, not a target, a counterpart, a partner, a twin. And as the chrysalis peeled away further, revealing more of the impossible architecture within, the object pulsed once more. A sharp, bright shock of silver light that travelled across the solar system like a single, enormous heartbeat. Earth responded instantly. The lattice flashed. The oceans heaved. The crust vibrated. The atmosphere dimmed. Every system aligned in unison, as if bowing to the signal. The planetary transformation was entering its final stage, and there was no turning back. The chrysalis did not break open with violence. It unfolded with elegance, slow, deliberate, impossibly controlled, like a flower blooming in perfect mathematical rhythm. Each petal-like layer peeled away soundlessly, revealing deeper structures within. The inner shell wasn't made of matter as humans understood it. It oscillated between solid and luminous, between shape and vibration, never settling into one state long enough to be categorized. High-frame telescopes tried to lock onto it. They failed. Every time a camera attempted to capture a still image, the interior rearranged itself. Form, unform, form again. Except the new form was never quite the same as the last, as if the object was choosing, refining, becoming. Inside Umbra, no one spoke, not because there were no questions, but because there were too many, too enormous, too dangerous to whisper in the presence of something that seemed to respond to thought itself. And then finally the chrysalis reached its limit. The final layer dissolved into a ring of dust-like particles, each glowing with its own faint silver light. The dust scattered outward, forming a perfect halo around the object. And at the centre, for the first time, the core became visible, a sphere, smooth, seamless, radiant, and in constant motion, not spinning, but rotating through itself, layers of dimensions sliding like transparent gears. The object was no longer a rock, no longer a relic, no longer a visitor. It was a star-like intelligence wrapped in architecture, a consciousness expressed through geometry, a blueprint of itself made visible, and within its impossible glow Earth's new reflection became clear. The moment the chrysalis vanished, the planet changed again. Clouds across the world began forming a single, unified spiral visible from orbit, a planet-sized diagram slowly rotating around the equator. Satellite imagery showed that every atmospheric current was aligning into a single direction, as if Earth's weather had been seized by a hidden hand. Lightning storms stopped. Jet streams froze in place. Rain ceased entirely. The atmosphere had become obedient, predictable, coordinated. People on the ground noticed the silence first. The wind stopped, not slowed, stopped. Leaves hung motionless on trees. Flags drooped as though soaked in water. Birds hovered in the air for a moment longer than gravity should allow, as if they too were caught in the stillness before dropping to the ground in confusion. Nature was pausing, listening, waiting. Then came the light. The sky brightened with a soft silver glow, the same hue as the interior of the chrysalis. Not sunlight, not moonlight, something else. A light that didn't cast shadows. A light that didn't warm the air. A light that vibrated faintly, subtly, like a distant hum felt through the skin rather than heard with the ears. This was the first global sign that Earth's atmosphere was no longer simply illuminated, it was being charged. Umbra's atmospheric physicists scrambled to interpret the readings. Air particles were behaving as if the sky were becoming ionized from above, not below. Electric fields inverted, photon scattering reversed. Clouds reflected light in wavelengths that shouldn't exist on Earth. And then the horizon bent. Across every coastline on the planet, observers watched as the distant line where sea met sky lifted upward, curving slightly. A subtle dome forming over the world, not a visual trick, not refraction, not temperature gradient. Space itself was bending. Earth was developing a boundary layer, the same kind of boundary that once surrounded 3I Atlas during its earliest anomalies, a planetary chrysalis, invisible but undeniable. Inside Umbra, a young theorist whispered the thought that froze everyone in the room. We're inside the same process, the exact same one. As if in response, the core of 3I Atlas brightened, then dimmed, then brightened again, faster each time, a heartbeat, a countdown, a synchronization signal, and with each pulse, Earth's lattice flashed. The pulses had become commands, and Earth obeyed. The oceans were the next to change. Ships reported the water turning glass-like, not freezing, not solidifying, but losing all surface movement. Waves smoothed into perfect stillness. The sea became a mirror. Marine life rose to the surface without distress, as if drawn upward. Whales breached not to breathe, but to orient themselves. Their echolocation patterns shifted into harmonic tones, the same tones detected days earlier in the deep trenches. When hydrophones recorded these new calls and played them back visually, the waveform displayed a perfect spiral. The same spiral repeated in every system on Earth. Even biology had joined the lattice. Inside Umbra, the final pattern emerged. The projection showed Earth's electromagnetic field now reshaped into the same three-layer structure as the interior of the object. An outer shell, a boundary ring, and a vibrating core. Earth was becoming a three-tiered resonant body. Identical to 3I Atlas. Identical, not similar, not influenced, replicated. The object wasn't interacting with Earth. It was rewriting Earth, rewriting its structure, its identity, its frequency. And then, with devastating clarity, the final piece locked into place. Earth's magnetic poles, briefly merged earlier, now separated again. But they didn't return to their old positions. They moved, sliding across the mantle like beads on a wire, drifting toward new coordinates. Coordinates that matched, exactly, perfectly, impossibly, the magnetic architecture of the object's core. The planet wasn't adapting, it was aligning. And as the chrysalis around 3I Atlas peeled away completely, revealing the luminous core in its full, impossible geometry, Dr. Lior spoke the conclusion no one wanted to voice. It's not sinking us to understand it, it's sinking us to become it. Earth was no longer just responding to 3I Atlas, it was transforming into its counterpart, its mirror, its second form, and the process was not slowing, It was accelerating. The next phase would not be subtle. It would be undeniable. A global revelation, impossible to hide and impossible to stop. The metamorphosis was reaching its climax. As the luminous core of 3I Atlas stabilized in open space, something extraordinary happened. The object stopped pulsing. The erratic flashes, the irregular oscillations, the rising frequency cycles, all of it ceased. Instead, the core emitted a single steady glow, constant, balanced, perfect. To the untrained observer, it looked like a simple sphere of radiant silver, but to Umbra's instruments it was terrifying. The reading showed that the core's frequency had reached equilibrium, a complete stable harmonic. This was no longer a process. It was a state, a finished state, and the moment the core locked into that constant resonance, Earth followed. The atmospheric lattice brightened until the entire sky glowed like frosted glass. Cities beneath it felt as though they were living inside a giant lantern. Gentle, diffuse illumination filtering down from every direction, even in the dead of night. Stars vanished behind the brightness. The moon blurred, then dissolved into the glowing canopy. People couldn't tell what time it was anymore. Clocks worked, but the sky refused darkness. In New Zealand, a man stood outside at midnight and whispered, "It feels like the planet is dreaming." Around the world, millions agreed. The air felt thicker, the horizon felt closer, and the world felt strangely conscious. Not alive, not aware, but present. As if the Earth was paying attention. This was the first visible proof that the planet's transformation had crossed the biological threshold. Everything, atmosphere, water, crust, magnetosphere, was responding as a unified whole. Earth wasn't a collection of systems anymore. It was a single system, a single body, a single structure, a single self. At 04:22 UTC, the next event began. No alarms, no warnings. The sky simply moved, not clouds, not storms. The lattice itself, the luminous geometric framework covering the planet, shifted position, not drifting, shifting, instantly, smoothly, like a puzzle piece sliding into a new orientation. Every line, every arc, every spiral pattern rotated by exactly 19.5 degrees. The same angle observed inside 3I Atlas when its core first activated. The planet had just performed the same rotation. In Umbra, a single phrase appeared on the auto-generated monitoring log. Phase alignment achieved. Outside, no one saw the message, but everyone felt the shift. People reported a sense of weightlessness for half a second. Not enough to lift them off the ground, just enough to loosen gravity's grip, as if the planet briefly forgot how to hold them. Animals reacted violently. Birds launched into the air all at once. Dogs barked at nothing. Cats froze, pupils dilated. Deep in the forest, entire herds of deer bolted in synchronized motion. It was as if every living creature sensed the exact moment the Earth became something more than a world, as if something inside them whispered, "Wake up, something is coming." Then came the light pillars. Across dozens of countries, beams of silver light shot downward from the atmospheric lattice, touching the ground in perfect straight lines. Each beam was wide, some nearly a kilometre across, and perfectly still. Not burning, not hot, not damaging, just present. Like columns marking specific coordinates on the surface. High-altitude drones captured footage that made the Umbra room fall silent. The beams were not random. They formed a pattern, a global pattern. Every beam intersected with a known magnetic node of the crust. Every node connected to a convergence point in the sky, and every convergence point matched the geometry inside the core of 3I Atlas. Earth was no longer being influenced. It was being mapped. One scientist whispered, "These are anchor points. It's creating a grid through the planet." A grid for what? A structure? A network? A consciousness? No one dared guess. When the beam stabilized, the next transformation began quietly, almost beautifully. Across every city, every forest, every ocean, small particles of luminous dust began falling from the glowing sky. Soft, delicate, weightless. People extended their hands and watched the dust settle on their skin. It didn't burn. It didn't melt. It didn't dissolve. It hummed. faintly, like the tiniest vibration passing through the fingertips. Microscopy revealed the impossible. The dust wasn't solid, it was patterned. Every fragment contained a perfect geometric sequence, the same repeating lattice inside the object's core. It wasn't debris, it was data, encoded in matter, falling across the entire world, and Earth absorbed it. The ocean swallowed it, forests inhaled it, the crust pulled it downward, everything the dust touched synchronized, ecosystems aligned, weather stilled, electrical systems hummed with quiet uniformity. The planet wasn't resisting the change, it was completing it. Umbra's internal models updated one final time. This time, the projection didn't show a process, it showed an outcome. The two structures, Earth's altered magnetic shell and the core of 3I Atlas, overlaid perfectly. Every spiral, every angle, every node. Earth was no longer becoming the object. Earth now was the object, expressed on a planetary scale. Not a copy, not an imitation, a manifestation. The scientists stared at the model in stunned silence. Someone finally murmured, "We weren't the target. We were the medium. It wasn't invasion. It wasn't infection. It wasn't destruction. It was transmission, a transfer of identity, a replication of state across distance." The core of 3I Atlas had awakened, and Earth, like a tuning fork struck by a higher frequency, was awakening with it. The next pulse would not change the planet, it would define it. For several minutes, Earth held its new shape with eerie stability. The atmosphere glowed, the ocean stilled, the beams of silver light remained frozen in place like colossal pillars holding up the sky. The planet looked complete, finished, as if the transformation had reached its final step. But deep beneath the crust, something continued shifting. Sensors buried miles underground recorded a soft creaking. Not seismic movement, but structural reconfiguration. The mantle itself was changing density. The core flickered between magnetic states. It wasn't violent, it wasn't destructive, it was purposeful, like a world aligning its internal clocks before something important. Inside Umbra, the air felt heavy. The scientists sat motionless, staring at the projections that now showed Earth not as a planet, but as a vast, glowing sphere of layered resonance, a structure indistinguishable from 3I Atlas's own core. The data wasn't fluctuating anymore, it was static, perfect, complete. And that was what frightened them most. Earth wasn't in transformation anymore, Earth was waiting. Outside, people felt it too. A strange stillness settled over the world, deeper than silence. Even in the busiest cities, even in the densest crowds, no one spoke above a whisper. The air felt thick, like sound itself had weight. Some people pressed their palms against the ground, claiming they could feel a heartbeat in the soil. Others reported hearing faint tones drifting through the atmosphere, like distant singing carried on a wind that no longer blew. But the tones weren't random. They followed a pattern, a rhythm, a countdown. And then, without warning, the pillars of light disappeared. Not faded, disappeared, instantly, as though they had been switched off simultaneously by a signal too precise to be human. The sky dimmed, the lattice flickered, the glowing dust in the air spiraled upward, drawn back into the atmosphere like iron filings being pulled toward a magnet. Every fragment of luminous matter flowed into a single point directly above the equator, a point that began to open. The atmospheric shell split into a massive circular aperture, a perfect ring revealing a deep darkness behind it, darker than night, darker than space. Sensors detected nothing inside the opening. Not vacuum, not energy, not matter. It was a null zone, a place where the laws of physics didn't apply. A doorway. For several seconds the world stared up at that silent circle of pure void, a wound in the sky, a mouth, a threshold. Then a sound rose from the centre of the ring, not through the air, not through vibration, but directly into the nervous systems of every living creature. A low resonant tone, authoritative, calm, ancient. The same tone recorded in the deepest parts of the Pacific days before, now amplified across the entire world. Children began crying without knowing why. Animals bowed their heads. People clutched their chests, feeling something inside them responding. Not fear, not panic, recognition. Inside Umbra, one researcher stared at the waveform as it stabilized on her monitor. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "It's the same frequency as Earth's heartbeat now." The tone intensified, forming harmonics, layers, sequences, a language without words, an instruction written in vibration, a signal that bypassed thought and spoke directly to biology. And then it changed. It shifted upward into a pure, ringing note that simultaneously reached every resonant point across the planet. The crust, the atmosphere, the oceans, the magnetosphere, even the interior of the core. Earth responded. Everything responded. Every system aligned in a single synchronized pulse that traveled through the planet like a global exhale. The entire world hums. That was when the object moved. Not through space, not through propulsion. It simply slid, gently, fluidly, into a new position. A position aligned perfectly with the aperture above Earth's equator. The glowing core of 3I Atlas began to pulse again. Slowly at first, then faster, each wave brighter, denser, more structured. It wasn't chaotic, it wasn't random, it was transmitting. For the first time since its arrival, the object was broadcasting in a form that resembled information, compressed layers of resonance folding into each other like pages in a book, not a message, a program. Earth's lattice responded instantly. Lines of light flared to life across the sky, connecting every continent with a highway of luminous geometry. The beams returned, but this time they shot upward, from the planet, not toward it. Streams of silver energy rising like pillars holding the world in place. The aperture widened. The darkness behind it shimmered like liquid, and the entire planet felt a subtle pulling sensation, as though gravity had shifted direction, not outward, not inward, but sideways, towards something unseen. In the deepest chambers of Umbra, where the most sensitive instruments were kept, a single reading appeared that made every scientist freeze. Spatial coherence, complete space itself had synchronized. The object wasn't just altering Earth, it was connecting Earth to somewhere else. Then the light changed. The lattice flickered, dimmed, then erupted in dazzling brilliance that washed the world in silver luminance. The oceans reflected it like molten mirrors. Cities glowed at their edges. Mountains shimmered with halos. Every resonant node on the planet burst into light. 10,000 beams shooting skyward. The air trembled with a great rising hum that shook buildings and rattled bones, but did not harm a single thing. For one moment, the entire planet became a glowing sphere of pure geometry, a mirror image of the object's awakened core, a twin star waiting to ignite. And then, the final pulse came. A surge of energy erupted from the object, enveloping Earth in a wave so vast, so bright, so absolute that every instrument went blind. Every camera, every satellite, every telescope, every sensor, even human sight failed. The world went white. No sound, no motion, no thought, just whiteness, absolute and complete. The pulse lasted 6 seconds, only 6. When light and vision finally returned, Earth was unchanged, or at least, it appeared unchanged. The sky was blue again, clouds drifted naturally, waves rolled in the ocean, animals moved freely, wind returned, gravity settled. The lattice was gone, the beams were gone, the dust was gone, the aperture sealed. It was as if nothing had happened, except for one detail. 3I Atlas was no longer visible. The object had vanished, not drifted, not accelerated, not faded, vanished, with no trace, no debris, no radiation, no afterglow. It was simply gone. For 3 hours, Umbra scrambled to understand what had occurred. They replayed data, analysed readings, mapped residual fields. Everything told the same story. The transformation event completed. The resonance process ended. The system stabilised. Earth was now in a new state. Subtle, quiet, invisible, but unmistakable. The planet's magnetic baseline had shifted. Global frequency signatures had doubled. Animals were behaving differently. Human EEGs showed patterns never before recorded. Earth was not the same world. Then came the final discovery, the one that made the room fall silent. A tiny, almost imperceptible signal was detected echoing through the planet's new magnetic field. Not from space, not from technology, from Earth, from the planet itself. A repeating pattern, 3 tones, soft, calm, deliberate, played every 29 hours, the same interval 3i Atlas used before it awakened. Earth was broadcasting, not noise, not distortion, a signal. And when Umbra decoded the pattern, the translation was simple. Phase 1 complete. The scientists stared at each other, expressionless, breathless, hollowed out by the quiet enormity of what the planet had just said. Earth wasn't waiting anymore. It was preparing. For Phase 2. Whatever Phase 2 was. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of telescopes or sensors, something that heard the broadcast which would eventually answer. The final line of Umbra's emergency report put it plainly, without emotion. 3i Atlas did not arrive here. It activated us.